Most political fights in Washington are loud. This one is exhausting. Not because the arguments are complicated, but because they never seem to end. It is the kind of conflict where both sides insist they are defending reality while accusing the other of rewriting it. And if that sounds familiar, sit tight, because this story explains why it keeps happening. Hakeem Jeffries tells one story, and he tells it with unwavering consistency. January 6th was not a misunderstanding, not a metaphor, not a difference of perspective. It was an attack. It was visible, and the country watched it unfold in real time. For Jeffries, there is no gray area to negotiate. Facts are not a starting point for debate. They are the foundation. The MAGA response is not a denial so much as a reframing. They do not say nothing happened. They say what happened has been distorted, exaggerated, weaponized. They talk less about broken windows and more about broken trust. And they insist the real scandal is not the event, but the investigation that followed. Sit tight. This is where the argument stops being about facts and starts being about power. Jeffries frames the clash like a civics test that half the class keeps trying to retake. He speaks as if the answers were already written on the board. Violence against police was real. The breach of the Capitol was real. And pretending otherwise, in his view, is not skepticism. It is sabotage. MAGA lawmakers hear that framing and bristle. To them, Jeffries sounds less like a referee and more like a narrator who already chose the ending. They accuse him of moral theater, of freezing one moment in time to avoid discussing everything else Americans are struggling with. And that accusation resonates because distraction is a currency everyone spends in Washington. Here's the first uncomfortable question that hangs over the entire debate. If you have to keep relitigating what millions of people watched with their own eyes, are you protecting truth? Or are you protecting a brand that cannot afford to admit complexity? Jeffries believes repetition preserves reality. MAGA believes repetition manufactures it. The irony is that both sides accuse the other of obsession. Jeffries says MAGA cannot stop minimizing January 6th because acknowledging it would fracture their coalition. MAGA says Democrats cannot stop replaying it because it is the only moment where they feel morally dominant. Meanwhile, voters sit like exhausted umpires at a family barbecue, watching the same argument get reheated again. Nobody ordered these leftovers, but nobody seems willing to throw them away. Jeffries keeps returning to the injured officers for a reason. It grounds the argument in flesh, not theory. Bruises, broken doors, blood on the floor. Those details resist abstraction. They force the debate out of the realm of motive and back into consequence. MAGA keeps returning to intent for an equally strategic reason. Intent is elastic. Intent can be debated indefinitely. Intent allows sympathy to override accountability. And intent shifts focus away from what happened to why someone thinks it happened. One side insists video evidence is enough. The other insists video needs context, editing, explanation, and the right interpreter. Congress starts to resemble a courtroom where no one agrees on the rules of evidence. Jeffries sounds like a prosecutor reading charges into the record. MAGA sounds like a defense team arguing the investigation itself is the crime. The humor in this clash is dark but unavoidable. Both sides accuse the other of propaganda while campaigning like full-time content creators. Jeffries warns about whitewashing history. MAGA warns about narrative control. Everyone claims to be protecting democracy, and no one agrees on what that protection looks like. Here is the second controversial question people avoid asking directly. When did law and order become conditional? When did accountability start depending on who it applies to? And when did patriotism turn into a loyalty test instead of a principle? Those questions make everyone uncomfortable, which is why they keep resurfacing. Jeffries treats patriotism as loyalty to institutions, even when they produce outcomes you dislike. He speaks like someone trying to staple facts permanently into the congressional record, not to win the argument today, but to preserve it for tomorrow. MAGA treats patriotism as loyalty to people, especially when institutions feel hostile. They speak like a movement under siege, not a party sharing power. That difference explains the tone. Jeffries is methodical, almost ceremonial. MAGA is combative, suspicious, energized by resistance. One side sounds like it is filing history. The other sounds like it is fighting it. There is a strange satire in watching both sides accuse the other of never moving on. Jeffries says MAGA cannot let go because January 6th threatens their narrative. MAGA says Jeffries cannot let go because January 6th is his moral leverage. Congress starts to resemble group therapy, where everyone insists they have healed while reopening the wound every week. Nothing says closure like reopening the case louder than last time. From my own perspective, this is where the debate becomes genuinely dangerous. Not because one side is lying and the other is telling the truth, but because both sides are training the public to treat memory as a weapon. Jeffries uses memory as a warning label. MAGA uses memory as a battleground. Jeffries wants January 6 frozen in place as a lesson, something you point to and say never again. MAGA wants it reframed as an overblown moment hijacked by bad actors, something that should not define the movement or the future. Both positions claim moral urgency, and that is precisely the problem. Here is the question that actually matters. If a country cannot agree on what happened in plain sight, how does it agree on anything it cannot see? If reality itself becomes negotiable, what replaces it? And who decides when disagreement turns into denial? Those answers will shape far more than one election. As the argument drags on, something subtle but important begins to happen. The fight stops being about convincing the other side. It becomes about outlasting them. And endurance in American politics often matters more than persuasion. Whoever can repeat their version of reality the longest usually wins by default. Hakeem Jeffries understands this dynamic better than most people give him credit for. That is why he keeps returning to the same facts, the same images, the same language. Critics call it preaching. Supporters call it discipline. In truth, it is an attempt to anchor reality before it drifts completely into opinion. MAGA lawmakers recognize the strategy immediately, even if they refuse to admit it. Their counter is not to disprove the facts outright. It is to overwhelm them. 2, to flood the space with alternative explanations, competing grievances, and endless suspicion. Not because those explanations are stronger, but because noise exhausts attention. This is the second phase of the conflict, and it is far more dangerous than shouting. Shouting wakes people up. Exhaustion puts them to sleep. And a tired audience stops checking claims. They stop comparing narratives. Jeffries sounds increasingly like a man filing evidence into a permanent record. He talks slowly. He repeats himself. He refuses to escalate his language, even when provoked. That restraint is not accidental. Restraint signals confidence, but it also frustrates opponents who thrive on reaction. MAGA figures want the argument to feel explosive. They want outrage to look mutual. They want Jeffries angry, because anger equalizes the field. Calm creates imbalance. There is a dark humor in how this plays out. MAGA accuses Jeffries of never moving on. At the same time, they promise new investigations into the same event for entirely different reasons. Apparently, revisiting January 6th is only unhealthy when Democrats do it. When Republicans do it, it becomes oversight. Jeffries keeps pointing to injured officers because bodies do not argue back. They do not reinterpret themselves. They do not change depending on who narrates them. Broken doors and bloodied uniforms resist spin. That is precisely why MAGA shifts the conversation away from them. Instead, MAGA returns to motives. Motives are endlessly flexible. Motives can be debated forever without resolution. Motives allow sympathy to replace accountability, and motives redirect attention away from consequences. Here is another controversial question the debate refuses to settle. When did backing law enforcement start coming with footnotes? When did support become conditional? And who gets to decide which officers count and which ones are inconvenient? Neither side likes where that question leads. There is also a strange irony that makes the entire clash feel almost satirical. Jeffries accuses MAGA of obsessing over January 6th. MAGA accuses Jeffries of refusing to let it go. Both accusations are true, and that mutual truth is exactly why the argument never resolves. Congress begins to resemble a group therapy session with no moderator. Everyone insists they have processed the trauma. Everyone insists the other side is stuck in the past. And everyone brings the same grievance back every week. Closure, apparently, requires endless repetition. From my own perspective, this is where the conflict becomes less about January 6 itself. It becomes about ownership of memory. Jeffries treats memory as a warning label, something you preserve so it cannot be repeated. MAGA treats memory as a liability to be managed. Whoever controls memory controls meaning, and whoever controls meaning controls loyalty. Jeffries frames loyalty as allegiance to institutions even when they disappoint you. MAGA frames loyalty as allegiance to people, especially when institutions feel hostile. Those definitions are incompatible, and both sides know it. There is a bleak comedy in watching lawmakers accuse each other of rewriting history while auditioning to narrate it. Jeffries sounds like a man reading a warning label slowly, hoping people finally hear the part about irreversible damage. MAGA sounds like a group insisting the label was written by someone with an agenda. Both speak with confidence. Only one consistently speaks about consequences. This leads to another uncomfortable question no one wants to answer directly. If January 6th was no big deal, why does so much effort go into minimizing it? And if it was a national trauma, why does half the country treat mentioning it like an attack? Traumas do not fade because people stop talking about them. They fade when they are understood. And this one, clearly, is not. Jeffries keeps returning to footage because footage does not negotiate. It does not care about political incentives. It does not respond to outrage. It simply shows what happened. MAGA keeps returning to intent, because intent can never be conclusively settled. Video answers what? Motives argue why. And somewhere between those two, the line between accountability and grievance begins to blur. That blur is not accidental. It is where political advantage lives. There is also an uncomfortable reality that neither side wants to admit out loud. January 6th refuses to stay in the past because its political rewards are still active. MAGA does not revisit it because they enjoy the memory. They revisit it because outrage still mobilizes loyalty. Jeffries does not revisit it because it is convenient. Pretending something did not matter is how democracies quietly unlearn self-defense. And Jeffries understands that better than most. He is not arguing to persuade MAGA. He is arguing for the record, for future voters and future moments when the same excuses return. MAGA, meanwhile, is not trying to persuade Jeffries either. They are signaling strength, defiance, loyalty. They are telling their base that standing with their people matters more than verdicts. This is not a misunderstanding. It is political theater with a purpose, and pretending otherwise misses the point entirely. One side is trying to preserve permanence. The other is trying to generate momentum. At this stage, the argument stops circling January 6th and starts orbiting something bigger. Normalization. Not normalization of violence, at least not openly. Normalization of excuses. Normalization of the idea that reality is optional when it becomes inconvenient. Hakeem Jeffries does not accuse MAGA of plotting another crisis. He doesn't need to. Instead, he warns about repetition, about how constant reinterpretation dulls outrage, about how exhaustion quietly replaces accountability. He argues that democracies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. They erode when exceptions stop feeling exceptional, when explanations start to sound like justifications, when "let's move on" arrives before consequences are fully understood. That framing is calm, but it is anything but soft. MAGA hears this and rejects the premise entirely. They insist Jeffries is catastrophizing, that institutions are stronger than one bad day, that Americans are resilient enough to handle disagreement. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. The assumption is that time heals everything. That distance automatically produces clarity. That memory fades naturally if something truly lacks importance. Jeffries challenges that assumption directly. He argues that time only heals what is acknowledged. Ignored wounds do not heal. They fester. They get reframed. They get politicized. And, eventually, they get repeated. MAGA counters by accusing Jeffries of weaponizing memory. They argue that he keeps the country stuck in the past to avoid confronting present failures, high prices, healthcare costs, broken promises that never made it past the campaign stage. Politics has always used distraction. Jeffries knows this. MAGA knows this. The difference is which distraction they believe is more dangerous. Jeffries fears distraction from accountability. MAGA fears distraction from grievance. They believe unresolved resentment is political fuel. Jeffries believes unresolved truth is political poison. That disagreement explains why both sides keep returning to the same moment, not because they enjoy it, but because it serves different purposes. There is a sharp, almost accidental humor in how this plays out. MAGA lawmakers accuse Democrats of fear-mongering. At the same time, they campaign on the idea that the country is under constant threat. The threat just changes costumes. Sometimes it's immigrants, sometimes bureaucrats, sometimes judges. January 6th becomes inconvenient because it flips the script. It shows danger coming from inside the house. That does not fit neatly into a movement built on external enemies, so the focus shifts from actions to intentions. Here is another uncomfortable question the debate raises without answering. If January 6th was exaggerated, why did so many participants seek pardons instead of trials? And if it was justified, why do its defenders spend more time attacking investigators than defending actions? Confidence usually does not require this many disclaimers. That contradiction lingers. Jeffries understands the optics war better than many of his critics admit. He knows repeating facts is no longer about persuasion. It is about anchoring reality before it drifts completely into opinion. He is not trying to change MAGA's mind. He is trying to preserve a reference point for everyone else. MAGA understands something equally important. That noise can turn certainty into fatigue. That fatigue can turn vigilance into indifference. And that indifference often looks like agreement from a distance. They do not need to win the argument. They only need people to stop checking, stop comparing, stop caring enough to push back. Exhaustion becomes the substitute for consensus, and in American politics, that substitute is dangerously effective. This is where the humor turns bleak. Both sides accuse the other of weaponizing history, while quietly sharpening it for the next election cycle. January 6th becomes less a warning and more a tool, pulled out when useful, dismissed when inconvenient. Jeffries keeps hinting at a danger that goes beyond one event: normalization of selective outrage, normalization of selective accountability, normalization of the idea that democracy only matters when it produces your preferred outcome. That threat does not announce itself loudly. It arrives politely, wrapped in rhetoric about fairness, justified by claims of persecution, smoothed over by calls to move on, and by the time people notice, the ground has already shifted. MAGA dismisses this as melodrama. They argue that one protest, even a chaotic one, does not define a nation, that institutions have survived worse, that Democrats exaggerate because fear mobilizes donors. Again, the argument contains a partial truth. Institutions are resilient, but they are not self-sustaining. They rely on shared norms, shared limits, shared agreement about what crosses the line. Jeffries responds, without saying it outright, that institutions only matter if people defend them when it's inconvenient, when doing so costs votes, when it costs silence, when it costs friendships. That is not an emotional argument. It is a structural one, and structural arguments tend to outlast personalities. They do not trend well. They do not excite crowds, but they shape what comes next. By the final stretch, the argument no longer needs January 6th to stay alive. It has outgrown the date. What remains is a struggle over what the country does when memory becomes inconvenient. Not forgotten, not disproven, just inconvenient. And that distinction matters more than any slogan. Hakeem Jeffries speaks now less like a partisan and more like a custodian. He is not trying to score points. He is trying to lock something in place before it erodes. A shared understanding that some lines, once crossed, must stay visible because invisible lines invite repetition. MAGA hears this and bristles, not because they misunderstand it, but because they reject the premise. They argue that clinging to one moment risks freezing the country in permanent accusation, that moving forward requires loosening the grip of memory, that a nation obsessed with its scars cannot function. It sounds reasonable, and that is why it resonates. Sit tight. Reasonable arguments often hide irreversible trade-offs. Jeffries counters with a warning that does not sound dramatic, but is. Nations do not fall apart because they remember too much. They fall apart because they remember selectively, because some lessons are preserved while others are negotiated away, because convenience slowly replaces principle. The heart of this conflict is not disagreement. It is normalization. Normalization of excuses. Normalization of conditional accountability. Normalization of the idea that loyalty can outrank law without consequence. MAGA insists this framing is unfair. They argue that institutions have failed too many people to deserve blind trust. That skepticism is not sabotage, but self-defense. That power has insulated itself for decades, and anger is the only language it hears. This argument lands because frustration is real. From my own perspective, this is where the truth becomes uncomfortable for everyone. Jeffries is right that democracy cannot survive if reality becomes optional. MAGA is right that institutions lose legitimacy when they stop serving the people. What neither side fully confronts is how easily those truths collide, and how hostily that collision can become. The future Jeffries is warning about does not arrive with sirens. It arrives quietly, with fewer objections, with less shock, with more shrugs. The future MAGA is pushing toward does not announce itself as chaos. It announces itself as correction, as resistance, as finally standing up to a system that feels rigged. History is full of moments that sounded exactly like that. The most controversial question hanging over all of this is deceptively simple. What happens the next time an election result is contested? Who gets to decide what counts as legitimate doubt? Who defines the boundary between protest and threat? And who benefits when that boundary stays blurry? Jeffries believes boundaries protect democracy. MAGA believes boundaries protect elites. Both believe they are defending the country. Both believe the other side is playing with fire. Neither fully trusts the public to sort it out alone. There is a bitter humor in watching both sides accuse the other of undermining unity. Jeffries is blamed for reopening wounds. MAGA is blamed for refusing to let them heal. But wounds do not heal when they are denied, and they do not heal when they are constantly exploited either. As elections approach, the stakes sharpen without anyone raising their voice. Jeffries talks about standards, evidence, rules that apply even when they hurt. MAGA talks about momentum, energy, loyalty, the right to challenge outcomes that feel illegitimate. These are not just political strategies. They are competing definitions of citizenship. One definition asks citizens to participate within constraints. The other asks them to fight against constraints that feel imposed. Both appeal to American instincts. Only one leaves room for losing without burning everything down. That difference is not rhetorical. The quiet danger Jeffries keeps pointing toward is not another single event. It is the erosion of shared standards. When facts become factions, when accountability becomes optional, when fatigue replaces vigilance. MAGA dismisses this as fear-mongering. They argue the country is tougher than that Americans can handle conflict, that constant warnings insult the public's intelligence. Again, The argument is not absurd, but toughness without restraint becomes recklessness. Skepticism without structure becomes cynicism. Anger without limits becomes permission. And permission, once granted, rarely stays narrow. This is the pattern Jeffries is trying to interrupt. The final irony is that both sides depend on the same public response: attention, engagement, belief that the outcome matters. If voters disengage, both narratives collapse. That is why this fight feels endless. It is not really about convincing the other side. It is about keeping people watching. Because the moment people stop watching, power operates unchecked, and unchecked power never favors the tired. In the end, this is not a story about one leader or one movement. It is a story about habits. What people excuse when it feels politically useful. What they normalize when it feels familiar. What they tolerate because the alternative feels exhausting. Jeffries chooses memory, not because it is inspiring, but because forgetting is easy. Forgetting lowers standards quietly. Forgetting turns exceptions into precedents. Forgetting makes the next breach easier to justify than the last. Memory, in his view, is not punishment. It is prevention. MAGA chooses defiance, not because it is reckless, but because compliance feels like surrender. That instinct comes from real alienation, real distrust, real experiences of being ignored. But defiance without limits does not fix broken systems. It replaces them with louder ones. The tragedy here is not disagreement. Disagreement is democratic. The tragedy is when disagreement replaces reality itself, when loyalty becomes mandatory and truth becomes negotiable. At that point, politics stops being about governance and starts being about belonging. This debate does not end with a verdict. It ends with a choice, repeated quietly every day. A choice about what to tolerate, what to excuse, what to dismiss as just politics. Those choices do not feel dramatic, but they accumulate. They shape what the country accepts next. They determine whether the next crisis is debated or repeated, and they decide whether democracy bends or breaks. History will not remember who trended. It will remember whether standards held, whether truth mattered when it was inconvenient, whether losing was treated as illegitimate or survivable. Those are the measures that outlast noise, and that is the quiet truth beneath all the shouting.